4.7 million people watched Chief Justice John Roberts ask Jasmine Crockett, "Who do you think you are?" But her response, "The moment you see Roberts walking out of that courtroom, you'll witness history being made." The Supreme Court building stood like a marble fortress on that Tuesday morning, February the 2nd. Sunlight carved through the towering columns, as if the very architecture had been designed to intimidate anyone who dared challenge the power within. Inside these hallowed halls, the most powerful judicial chamber in America was about to witness something unprecedented. Nobody saw it coming. Not the seasoned reporters who had covered every major case for decades, not the constitutional scholars who thought they knew every legal strategy. And certainly not Chief Justice John Roberts, who sat in his imposing chair like a king surveying his kingdom. The morning had started like any other Supreme Court session. Attorneys shuffled papers, clerks whispered procedural notes, and the gallery filled with the usual mix of law students, journalists, and political observers. The marble walls seemed to absorb sound, creating an atmosphere of reverent quiet that had intimidated lawyers and litigants for over 2 centuries. But today was different. Today, Jasmine Crockett was in the building. She entered the courtroom with her signature composure, each step measured and deliberate. Her black tailored suit was perfectly pressed. Her minimal jewelry caught the light just enough to command attention without seeming flashy. In her right hand, she carried a leather briefcase that looked unremarkable from the outside, worn at the corners, practical rather than expensive. But what was inside that case would rewrite Supreme Court history forever. As she took her designated seat in the attorneys section, Chief Justice John Roberts watched her with the kind of look typically reserved for uninvited guests at a private dinner party. It was a gaze that had silenced seasoned attorneys for 3 decades, the cold stare of a man who had never once questioned his own authority or had that authority questioned by others. Roberts knew who Jasmine was, of course. The media coverage had been extensive. Her congressional outbursts, her reputation as a troublemaker who didn't respect traditional political decorum. He had read the profiles, calling her uncompromising, aggressive, and a threat to institutional norms, but he didn't take her seriously. To him, she was just another politician seeking attention, another ambitious woman who would eventually learn her place in the established order. This young woman, Roberts thought to himself as he adjusted his black robes, actually thinks she can come into my courtroom and lecture me about the law? The irony was lost on him. Here was a man who had spent his entire career building walls around power, now facing a woman who had spent hers tearing them down. Jasmine settled into her chair with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in hostile territory. She placed her briefcase on the mahogany table in front of her, her movements economical and precise. No gesture was wasted, no movement was exaggerated. But the seasoned court reporters noticed something immediately. That briefcase wasn't ordinary. The edges were worn from heavy use, multiple tabs and labels stuck out from its sides, and when she set it down, it seemed substantial, heavy with purpose. The court stenographer, Patricia Mills, had been recording Supreme Court proceedings for 15 years. She had developed an instinct for tension, for the moments when history was about to pivot. As she watched Jasmine organize her materials with surgical precision, Patricia felt that familiar electricity in the air. Something was coming. In the press gallery, veteran Supreme Court reporter Linda Chen leaned forward slightly. She had covered every major case since Bush v. Gore, and she recognized the signs. The way Jasmine's fingers drummed once, just once, on her briefcase. The way she glanced at her watch, not to check the time, but to synchronize her breathing with some internal rhythm. The way she sat perfectly still while everyone else in the room fidgeted with nervous energy. This wasn't a woman preparing to argue a case. This was a woman preparing to detonate something. When Roberts called the session to order, his voice carried its usual authoritarian resonance, the kind of commanding tone that had been echoing through these chambers since the building opened in 1935. Today's hearing will address matters of constitutional interpretation and judicial precedent. This court has served as the bedrock of America's legal architecture for 230 years, and we gather here today to continue that sacred tradition. He paused deliberately, letting his gaze sweep across the room before settling, with unmistakable intention, on Jasmine. The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. "And this court," he continued, his voice dropping half an octone to add weight to his words, "is guided only by qualified legal minds who understand the gravity and responsibility of appearing before the highest court in our nation." The emphasis on qualified hung in the air like smoke. Every person in that courtroom understood the subtext. This wasn't just protocol, this was a warning shot. Roberts was establishing dominance before the real proceedings even began. In the press gallery, reporters exchanged glances. This was unusual. Chief Justices typically maintained strict neutrality, at least in their public statements. For Roberts to single out a specific attorney before arguments had even begun was unprecedented. Jasmine didn't react. Not a flinch, not a shift in posture, not even a change in breathing. She simply opened her leather portfolio, withdrew a Mont Blanc pen that had seen better days, and began taking notes. Her handwriting was neat, controlled, each letter formed with the precision of someone who had learned to write under pressure. This complete non-reaction seemed to unsettle Roberts more than any outburst would have. He had expected provocation, an objection, an angry retort, some kind of emotional response he could use to justify his preemptive strike. Instead, Jasmine continued writing as if she were taking notes in a law school lecture hall. The psychological warfare had begun, and Roberts didn't realize he was already losing. In the audience, former public defender Maria Santos watched with growing recognition. She had seen Jasmine use this strategy before, years ago in a Dallas courtroom. A prosecutor had tried to intimidate Jasmine with personal attacks, and Jasmine had responded with this same calculated calm. She had let the prosecutor exhaust himself with increasingly desperate attempts to provoke a reaction, and then, when he was completely off balance, she had struck with surgical precision. "She's not ignoring him," Maria whispered to her companion. "She's letting him hang himself." Emboldened by what he perceived as Jasmine's submission, Roberts decided to press his advantage. It was a tactical error that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "Ms. Crockett," his voice grew noticeably sharper, each word carefully enunciated to maximize its cutting impact. "When your time to speak arrives, if indeed you are granted time to speak, I trust you will conduct yourself according to the established procedures of this court." The conditional phrase, "if indeed you are granted time," was a nuclear insult in the rarefied world of Supreme Court practice. It suggested that Jasmine's very presence was provisional, that her right to be heard was subject to Roberts' personal approval. The courtroom fell silent. Not the respectful quiet of judicial proceedings, but the stunned silence of a crowd witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Court Clerk James Davidson, who had been organizing case files, stopped mid-motion. His pen hovered over his notepad as he processed what he had just heard. This was beyond unusual. This was revolutionary, and not in a good way. Chief Justices simply did not question attorneys' qualifications in open court. They did not make veiled threats about speaking time. They certainly did not engage in what could only be described as public humiliation. Jasmine kept writing, but she paused for exactly 3 seconds. She looked up slowly, her dark eyes meeting Robert's pale blue ones across the formal distance of the courtroom. There was no anger in her gaze, no surprise either, no fear, no intimidation, no submission, just anticipation, like someone watching a clock they had already set to explode. "Of course, Chief Justice," she replied, her voice carrying the perfect tone of professional respect, while somehow managing to sound completely unimpressed. "I always follow proper procedures. In fact, I've made quite a study of them." Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but there was something in that last sentence, something that hung in the air like the scent of ozone before a thunderstorm. An unspoken, "and you should too," lingered in the silence that followed. Roberts felt it but couldn't identify it. He had thrown what should have been a knockout punch, and somehow it felt like he was the one staggering. Roberts made the classic mistake of generals throughout history. He assumed his enemy was fighting the same war he was. He interpreted Jasmine's measured responses as weakness, her calm as capitulation. He had no idea that while he was playing checkers, she was already 10 moves deep into a chess game. "In this court," Roberts continued, his confidence growing with each word, There is no place for political theater. There is no place for those who cannot understand our legal heritage, who cannot grasp the fundamental principles that have guided American jurisprudence for centuries. Each phrase was a small knife, designed to cut without seeming overtly hostile. Roberts was a master of this kind of psychological warfare, the art of destroying someone's credibility while maintaining plausible deniability about your intentions. The room tensed. Veteran reporters like Linda Chen had seen this dynamic before in lower courts, but never at the Supreme Court level. This was personal animosity being aired in the most formal judicial setting in America. It was unprecedented, unprofessional, and absolutely riveting television. Cameras focused on Jasmine, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the angry response, the defensive outburst, the emotional breakdown that would confirm every stereotype about unqualified people who dared to challenge the system. Instead, Jasmine looked up from her notes and smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a sarcastic smirk, but something almost appreciative, like someone who had just heard exactly what they were hoping to hear. "Chief Justice Roberts," she began, her voice carrying a warmth that somehow made the formal address sound almost intimate. "If we're going to discuss legal fundamentals and constitutional heritage, would you mind if I asked you a question? Just to clarify my understanding?" Roberts's frown deepened. This wasn't going according to script. "Question time hasn't arrived yet, Ms. Crockett. Surely someone with your background understands basic courtroom procedure." Another cut. Another attempt to position her as an outsider who didn't belong. "Of course," Jasmine nodded graciously. "I just wanted to ask about Marbury vs. Madison, the 1803 decision that established judicial review. You know, one of those fundamental principles you mentioned." The casual way she dropped the case name, like she was discussing the weather, sent a ripple through the legal scholars in the audience. Marbury vs. Madison wasn't just any case, it was the case, the foundation of the Supreme Court's power to strike down laws as unconstitutional. Roberts' expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A micro-expression of wariness crossed his features before he regained control. "What about it?" Jasmine opened her briefcase. The sound of the latches clicking seemed amplified in the silent courtroom. She reached inside and withdrew the first document, old paper, yellowed at the edges, with the unmistakable formatting of an academic journal. "This is your 1987 Law Review article from the Harvard Law Review. The Limits of Judicial Review, a Conservative Critique. You present quite an interesting perspective on Marbury." Roberts went very, very still. He remembered that article. He remembered it with the kind of visceral clarity that comes with memories you've spent decades trying to forget. It had been written during his conservative firebrand phase, when he was trying to make a name for himself by taking positions so far right they made Antonin Scalia look moderate. That article contained ideas that would be absolutely disqualifying for a Supreme Court justice. Ideas he had spent his entire confirmation process disavowing and distancing himself from. "That article," he started, but his voice caught slightly. "Yes," Jasmine interrupted with surgical smoothness. "This article. In it you wrote, and I'm quoting directly from page 847, that Marbury vs. Madison was a constitutional error of the highest magnitude. You even went further," she began reading in a clear prosecutorial voice that carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. "Judicial review creates an insurmountable barrier to democratic will, and the spectacle of unelected judges overturning the carefully considered decisions of elected representatives represents not a constitutional system, but an oligarchical perversion of democratic governance." The courtroom held its collective breath. Those weren't just academic criticisms. They were a complete repudiation of the Supreme Court's fundamental power, and they had come from the mouth of the man who now sat as Chief Justice. Color began to drain from Roberts' face like water from a broken dam. His hands, which had been resting confidently on his desk, now gripped the edges so tightly his knuckles showed white through his skin. This is being taken completely out of context," he tried to defend, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "That was an academic exercise, a theoretical exploration of—" "Oh, I understand completely," Jasmine interjected, her tone remaining perfectly reasonable. "Academic exploration, theoretical framework. I respect that." She reached into her briefcase again, which is why I was so interested in your follow-up piece. Stanford Law Review, 1985. Unelected Judges, Democratic Deficit, Why Lifetime Tenure Threatens American Democracy. This one was less theoretical. She pulled out a second document, this one marked with yellow highlighting and handwritten notes in the margins. "In this piece, you were quite explicit about your views. You wrote, 'Another pause for effect, another moment for the tension to build. The current structure of the Supreme Court represents nothing less than a remnant of aristocratic governance, a system designed to insulate power from popular accountability. Judges serve for life not because wisdom requires permanence, but because anti-democratic forces require protection from the will of the people.'" A audible gasp echoed from the gallery. Legal scholars shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't just criticism of judicial review. This was a fundamental attack on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself. Roberts stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a screech that seemed to echo forever. "Those writings were from a different time, a different context. They do not represent—" "Oh, but they do represent something," Jasmine said, her voice still calm but now carrying an undertone of steel. "They represent your true beliefs about this institution. Unless, of course, you're suggesting that your academic work was dishonest, that you wrote things you didn't believe for career advancement." The trap was elegant and inescapable. Either Roberts had meant what he wrote, making him a hypocrite who had spent decades wielding power he believed was illegitimate, or he had written academic fraud to advance his career. In the press gallery, veteran Supreme Court reporter Michael Adams felt his pulse quicken. In 30 years of covering the court, he had never seen anything like this. A sitting Chief Justice was being systematically dismantled by documents from his own past, and there was nowhere for him to hide. "But wait," Jasmine continued, reaching into her briefcase once more. "There's more recent evidence of your views, something a bit more contemporary." She pulled out a small digital device, a voice recorder that looked almost antique in the high-tech courtroom. "This is from 2019, a private dinner at the Federalist Society. You thought it was off the record." Roberts went pale. He knew exactly which dinner she was referring to. He could feel the blood draining from his face, as if someone had opened a valve. "That was a private conversation." "Was it?" Jasmine tilted her head slightly. "Because what I have here suggests otherwise." She pressed play. The audio quality was crystal clear. No static, no distortion, just Robert's voice, unmistakably his, speaking with the kind of candor that powerful men reserve for rooms they believe are safe. The voice that emerged from the speakers was Roberts, but not the careful, measured Roberts of public appearances. This was Roberts unguarded, speaking his truth. "Look, I'll be honest with you all. This Supreme Court system we're operating under, it needs fundamental change. Lifetime tenure is absolutely absurd. It's an 18th century solution to 21st century problems." A few people in the gallery gasped audibly. Roberts' own voice continued, "We should be serving fixed terms, maybe 12 years maximum. The idea that 9 people get to shape American law until they die or decide to retire, it's not democratic, it's not accountable. And frankly, it's not sustainable." But the recording wasn't finished. Roberts' voice grew more animated, more passionate. "And don't get me started on how we're selected. It's purely political theater. Presidents pick judges based on ideology, not qualifications. The confirmation process is a circus. Half the time, the best legal minds in the country won't even consider the job because they know it means having their entire lives dissected by partisan hacks." The courtroom was in stunned silence. This wasn't just criticism. This was a sitting Chief Justice calling the entire system illegitimate. Roberts' mind raced as he tried to formulate a response. The recording had been devastating, but maybe he could spin it, contextualize it, explain it away. This recording was taken without my consent. It's probably illegal, and it certainly violates every norm of judicial privacy and—" "Judicial privacy?" Jasmine's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's interesting, because just minutes ago you questioned my qualifications in open court. You seemed quite comfortable discussing my background publicly." She stood up, and for the first time, her voice carried real edge. "But let's talk about privacy, Chief Justice. Let's talk about what you thought would stay private forever." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents. The envelope was sealed with red wax, the kind of formal sealing typically reserved for classified government documents. "This envelope contains correspondence between you and members of the Bush administration during your confirmation process in 2005. Correspondence that was supposed to remain sealed for 50 years. Roberts' face went from pale to ashen. He knew exactly what was in those letters. The promises he had made, the assurances he had given, the ideological commitments that would have disqualified him from confirmation if they had been public knowledge. "You can't," he started. "I can't what?" Jasmine asked innocently. "I can't present evidence of judicial misconduct? I can't expose corruption at the highest levels of government? Or I can't do these things because I'm not qualified enough?" She broke the wax seal with deliberate ceremony, the red fragments falling to the table like drops of blood. "Let me read you just a small excerpt from a letter you sent to White House counsel Harriet Mears on July 15, 2005, Jasmine began, her voice taking on the cadence of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. "Dear Ms. Mears, thank you for clarifying the administration's expectations regarding key constitutional issues. I want to assure you that my judicial philosophy aligns completely with the President's vision for American law." She looked up from the letter to meet Roberts' horrified gaze. "Specifically, I share the administration's view that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided and should be overturned at the earliest opportunity. I also believe that affirmative action programs represent unconstitutional reverse discrimination and would vote to eliminate them entirely." The courtroom erupted. Reporters started typing frantically. Camera operators adjusted their equipment for better angles. This was no longer a routine court proceeding. This was a historical moment unfolding in real time. But Jasmine wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I believe the Commerce Clause has been interpreted far too broadly, and I would work to restrict federal regulatory power significantly. You can count on my vote to advance the President's agenda on these matters." Roberts tried to interrupt. "These letters were taken out of context. They don't represent—" "Don't represent what?" Jasmine's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "Don't represent promises you made to get this job? Don't represent the ideology you hid during your confirmation hearings?" She pulled out another letter. "Or perhaps you'd prefer to discuss this follow-up letter from August 3rd, where you wrote, 'I understand that loyalty to the President's agenda is expected, and I want to assure you that such loyalty will be absolute and unwavering.'" By now, Roberts was standing behind his bench, his composure completely shattered. His black robes, which had always seemed to lend him dignity and authority, now hung on him like a costume that no longer fit. "During your confirmation hearings," Jasmine continued relentlessly, "Senator Patrick Leahy asked you directly about your judicial philosophy. Do you remember your response?" Roberts said nothing. He couldn't. His throat felt like it was closing. "You said, and I'm quoting from the official transcript, 'Judges are like umpires. Umpires don't make the rules, they apply them. The role of an umpire and a judge is critical. They make sure everybody plays by the rules, but it is a limited role.'" She set down the confirmation transcript and picked up one of his letters to the Bush administration. "But here, in your private correspondence, you wrote, 'I see my role not as a neutral arbiter, but as an active agent of conservative constitutional restoration. The courts must be used to advance our ideological agenda, not merely to referee disputes.'" The contradiction was devastating. Roberts had lied under oath during his confirmation hearings, presenting himself as a neutral judicial umpire while privately promising to be a partisan warrior. "You lied to the Senate," Jasmine said simply. "You lied to America. You obtained this position through fraud." Roberts was reeling, but Jasmine had more ammunition. "Let's talk about Citizens United vs. FEC, she said, pulling out yet another document. "The 2010 decision that opened unlimited corporate spending in elections. You wrote the majority opinion." "That was a legally sound decision based on First Amendment principles," Roberts managed to say. though his voice was shaky. Was it? Jasmine held up a bank statement. Because this shows that 3 days before oral arguments in that case, your wife Patricia received a $500,000 consulting fee from Americans for Tax Reform, a group that would directly benefit from the decision. The courtroom exploded. This was beyond conflict of interest. This was potential bribery. That payment was for legitimate consulting work, Roberts protested. Consulting work that your wife was uniquely qualified for? Jasmine asked with mock innocence. Because according to her resume, her previous experience was in interior design and charity fundraising. What exactly was she consulting about for $500,000? She held up an email printout. Maybe this email from Grover Norquist to your wife explains it. Patricia, the $500K is just the beginning. If John votes the right way on Citizens United, we can arrange much more substantial compensation for your consulting firm. Roberts was now sweating visibly, small beads forming at his hairline despite the courtroom's air conditioning. You're taking private communications out of context, he said desperately. This is a coordinated attack on the independence of the judiciary. Independence? Jasmine laughed, a sound that somehow managed to be both musical and terrifying. Let's talk about independence. She opened a laptop computer that had been sitting closed beside her briefcase. The screen displayed a complex network diagram, like something from an FBI investigation. This diagram shows financial connections between Supreme Court justices and outside political organizations over the past 15 years. Would you like to guess whose name appears most frequently? Roberts didn't answer. He couldn't. That's right, yours. Your wife's consulting firm has received payments from 23 different conservative political organizations. Total value, $3.7 million. She clicked to the next slide. Here's your luxury vacation to Alaska, paid for by the Koch brothers. Here's your son's law school tuition, covered by a scholarship from the Heritage Foundation. Here's your daughter's wedding reception, held at a venue donated by the Federalist Society. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. Roberts gripped his bench for support. And here, Jasmine said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, is a letter from Justice Clarence Thomas to the Koch brothers, talking about our coordinated strategy and mentioning John's complete cooperation. The Thomas letter was the final piece of the puzzle Jasmine had been assembling. She read it aloud in its entirety. Dear David and Charles, John Roberts has been invaluable to our cause. His ability to write majority opinions that advance our agenda while maintaining the appearance of judicial neutrality is exactly what we need. The Citizens United decision was a masterpiece of conservative jurisprudence disguised as constitutional interpretation. Roberts tried to interrupt. That letter is authentic? Jasmine finished. Yes, it is. Verified by 3 independent handwriting experts and confirmed by metadata analysis. Justice Thomas wrote this letter on official Supreme Court letterhead. She continued reading. Roberts understands that the court's legitimacy depends on maintaining certain appearances, but he's equally committed to reshaping American law in ways that will benefit conservative causes for generations. His wife's consulting arrangement ensures his continued cooperation. The implications were staggering. Not only had Roberts been taking money from political organizations, but he was coordinating with other justices to advance a partisan agenda. But Jasmine had saved the most devastating evidence for last. Chief Justice Roberts, she said, her voice now carrying the authority of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, let's discuss your recusal record, or rather, your failure to recuse. She pulled out a thick binder, tabbed and organized like a case file. Over the past 10 years, you have voted on 47 cases where your wife's consulting firm had direct financial interests in the outcome. In 46 of those cases, you voted in favor of your wife's clients. Roberts was now openly trembling. I was not aware of every client my wife... Not aware? Jasmine's voice rose for the first time. Your wife forwarded you billing invoices. You signed tax returns listing this income. You attended dinner parties with these clients. She slammed a stack of documents on the table. Here are copies of your joint tax returns. Here are photos from social events. Here are email exchanges where you discuss specific cases with your wife while they were under consideration. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and completely damning. Roberts made one last desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. Even if these allegations were true, which I dispute, there's no evidence that these relationships influenced my judicial decisions. I have always voted according to my constitutional interpretation, not outside influences. It was exactly the response Jasmine had been hoping for. "Is that so?" she asked sweetly. "You've always voted according to your constitutional interpretation?" "Absolutely." "Under oath?" Yes, of course." "Perfect," Jasmine smiled, "because during your 2005 confirmation hearings, you swore under oath that you had no predetermined views on major constitutional issues. You said, and I quote, 'I have no agenda, I have no platform. Judges don't take political positions.'" She held up the Bush administration letters again. "But these letters show that you had already committed to overturning Roe v. Wade and eliminating affirmative action before you were even confirmed, which means you lied under oath to the United States Senate." Roberts's world was collapsing in real time. Perjury during confirmation hearings was grounds for immediate impeachment and removal from office. Those letters don't say what you think they say." "Don't they?" Jasmine asked. "Then let's clarify with some additional evidence." She reached into her briefcase one final time and withdrew what appeared to be a smartphone. "This contains text messages between you and Karl Rove from 2005, recovered from NSA archives through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that took 6 years to resolve." Robert's face went completely white. He knew those texts. He had thought they were permanently deleted. Text from you to Rove, July 20th, 2005. "Confirmation going well. Democrats buying the umpire story. Will deliver on all promises once confirmed." Text from Rove to you. "Perfect. Bush is counting on you. Roe must go. Voting rights must be gutted. Can we count on you?" Your response? "Absolutely. I'll give you the conservative revolution you want, but it will take time to avoid suspicion." The final text was the most damning. Text from you to Rove. "I understand my job is to serve conservative interests, not constitutional principles. I won't let you down." At this point, Roberts was no longer functioning as a Chief Justice. He was a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous.
"You have no right," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "No right to invade my privacy, to twist my words, to turn this sacred institution into a political circus." "Sacred institution?" Jasmine's voice was now loud enough to fill the courtroom without shouting. "Chief Justice Roberts, you turned this court into a political operation years ago. I'm just revealing what you tried to hide." She gestured to all the documents spread across her table. "This isn't a political attack. This is accountability. This is what happens when someone finally says enough." Roberts stumbled backward, his hand reaching for his chair but missing it entirely. This witch hunt ends now. I will not stand for—" "You're right," Jasmine said, her voice suddenly very quiet. "You won't stand. Because you can't. Not anymore." The implications of Jasmine's revelations began to sink in throughout the courtroom. If Roberts had obtained his position through fraud, if he had been taking money from political organizations, if he had been coordinating with other justices to advance partisan goals, then every decision the Supreme Court had made during his tenure was potentially illegitimate. Legal scholar Professor Amanda Richardson, watching from the gallery, felt her understanding of American jurisprudence crumble in real time. "This isn't just about one corrupt justice," she whispered to her colleague. "This could invalidate 15 years of Supreme Court decisions." In the press gallery, reporters were already drafting headlines that would dominate news cycles for months. Supreme Court Chief Justice exposed as fraud. Roberts took bribes, lied under oath. Constitutional crisis. Is the Supreme Court legitimate? But Jasmine wasn't done. She had one more revelation that would shake the foundations of American democracy. "Chief Justice Roberts," Jasmine said, her voice now carrying the weight of a judge pronouncing sentence, "everything I've shown you so far is about your personal corruption, but there's something bigger. Something that threatens the very foundation of our democracy." She opened her laptop again and projected an image onto the courtroom's display screen. It was an organizational chart showing connections between conservative organizations, political donors, and multiple Supreme Court justices. This is the Conservative Legal Network, a shadow organization that has been coordinating Supreme Court decisions for over a decade. And you, Chief Justice Roberts, have been its operational leader. Roberts could only stare at the screen in horror. The chart showed financial flows, communication patterns, and decision coordination between justices that would have been unthinkable to previous generations of Americans. Here's how it works, Jasmine explained, pointing to different parts of the chart. Conservative donors identify cases they want decided in their favor. They funnel money to justices through family members and consulting arrangements. The justices coordinate their votes and opinions to ensure predetermined outcomes. She clicked to the next slide. Here are 23 cases over the past 10 years where the outcome was decided before oral arguments even began. Cases where you received financial benefits from the winning parties. Cases where you coordinated with other justices to ensure specific results. But the worst part, Jasmine continued, is what you did to American democracy itself. Another slide appeared, showing a timeline of election-related cases. 2013, Shelby County versus Holder. You gutted the Voting Rights Act. 3 months later, your wife's firm received a $750,000 payment from a voter suppression organization. 2019, Rucho versus Common Cause. You allowed unlimited gerrymandering. 2 weeks later, Koch Industries donated $1 million to a charity run by your daughter. 2020, Bush v. Gore 2, the case that almost was. You were prepared to overturn a presidential election if necessary. We have the draft opinion you wrote but never published. Roberts was now leaning heavily on his bench, his breathing labored. You weaponized the Supreme Court, Jasmine said. You turned it into a tool of partisan politics and personal enrichment. You betrayed every principle this institution was supposed to represent. Something had shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. The initial shock was giving way to anger. Not at Jasmine for revealing these truths, but at Roberts for the betrayal they represented. In the gallery, former Supreme Court Clerk David Park stood up slowly. His voice carried across the silent room. Chief Justice Roberts, I served this court for 2 years. I believed in its integrity. What Ms. Crockett has revealed, it's not just corruption, it's treason against the Constitution itself. Other voices joined in. A retired federal judge. This is the darkest day in Supreme Court history. A constitutional law professor. These revelations require immediate investigation by Congress. A civil rights attorney. How many innocent people,